The hospital was a brick-and-mortar relic perched on the outskirts of town. Jake had driven past it a few times before taking the job, always feeling a subtle pull toward its eerie grandeur. When his boss offered the position, mentioning the special circumstances, Jake thought it was just corporate jargon for boring shifts. Hospitals were quiet at night, save for the occasional ambulance or late-night wanderer. Easy money, or so he thought. His first impression of the hospital was that it looked abandoned. The place wasn't a bustling city medical center, it was a modest 3-story building surrounded by overgrown grass and a rusted chain-link fence. When he walked in that first evening, the receptionist greeted him with a warm smile that did little to quell his nerves. "You must be Jake," she said cheerily. Her eyes lingered on him, as though trying to gauge whether he could handle what he'd signed up for. She handed him a clipboard with some forms to fill out and a single piece of paper titled, "Rules for Night Security." Rules. 1. Your shift begins at 10 p.m. Be in the security room by then. From 10:15 p.m. to 11 p.m., patrol the building. Politely ask any loiterers to leave. 2. Between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m., you may hear a knock at the front door. A woman will ask to see her husband. Do not answer. Pretend she isn't there. 3. The ICU lights must remain on at all times. If they go out, immediately turn them back on. If you hear screams, hide in the nearest bathroom until it stops. 4. If you see a girl with a teddy bear in the cafeteria, sit next to her. Do not speak unless she speaks first. Respond only to her questions. 5. Check on the patients in the general ward at 1 a.m. If one is sitting up, ask if they're okay and fulfill their request, but do not engage in additional conversation. 6. If it rains, open the front doors and allow people seeking shelter to come inside. Ensure they leave afterward. If someone lingers or seems off, avoid them at all costs. 7. If the security cameras fail at any time, hide immediately. Pray they don't find you. Jake chuckled as he read the list. This has to be a joke, he thought, but when he met the guard he was replacing, the man's expression was anything but humorous. Follow the rules, the man said, his voice low and gruff. You'll thank me later. Before Jake could respond, the guard patted him on the shoulder and left without another word. Jake sat in the security room, his fingers drumming on the desk. The cameras displayed empty halls bathed in dim, fluorescent light. The clock struck 10:15, and he stretched, ready to begin his first patrol. Jake started at the top floor, methodically moving from room to room. Each hallway was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt intentional. As he swept through the ICU, he found it unnervingly empty. He expected at least a skeleton crew of doctors or nurses, but there was no one. Just the hum of machinery and the faint buzz of overhead lights. At 10:32, Jake descended to the second floor. As he turned a corner, he froze. An old man stood at the end of the hall, his back to Jake, staring out a window. "Excuse me, sir," Jake called out. His voice echoed, and the man didn't move. "You're not supposed to be here at this hour. I'll have to ask you to leave." The old man turned slowly, his movements deliberate, as though time dragged him backward. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were cloudy like milky marbles. "Be careful of the surgeon," he said, his voice a whisper that somehow filled the space. Jake blinked, but before he could respond, the old man turned and shuffled down the stairs. Jake followed, but by the time he reached the ground floor, the man had vanished. Back in the security room, Jake replayed the encounter in his head, trying to rationalize it. Maybe the guy was a patient who had wandered off, but the odd warning gnawed at him. The surgeon. What surgeon? The hospital didn't even seem operational. At 11:10 p.m., a soft knock drew Jake's attention to the front door. The cameras showed a woman standing outside. Her face was obscured by long, dark hair, but her posture was tense. She knocked again, harder this time. Jake remembered the second rule: do not answer. Pretend she isn't there. Her knocking grew frantic. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. "I need to see my husband. He's dying." Jake clenched his jaw, his hand hovering over the intercom button. But something about her voice set him on edge. It wasn't just desperation, it was hunger. A deep, guttural sound crept into her pleas, like an animal imitating a human. "Please let me in," she whispered. Jake turned his back to the monitor, willing her to leave. Minutes passed, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When he finally glanced back at the screen, she was gone. At 12:15 a.m., the ICU lights blinked out. Jake cursed under his breath, grabbing his flashlight and hurrying toward the ward. The rules were clear. The lights must remain on. The corridor leading to the ICU was pitch black, and the air felt heavier, as though it were pressing against him. As Jake reached for the switch, a scream ripped through the silence. It wasn't a single voice, it was dozens, layered atop each other, shrieking in agony. He froze, his mind racing. "If you hear screams, hide." Jake darted into the nearest bathroom and locked the stall. The screams grew louder, filling his ears like a symphony of torment. Then came the footsteps, slow and deliberate, accompanied by a soft humming. "Welcome to the hospital," a voice sang. "Where shadows grow." The footsteps stopped just outside his stall. Through the gap beneath the door, Jake saw polished shoes, the kind a surgeon might wear. Blood seeped across the tile, pooling at the feet. "Is someone there?" the voice crooned. It was light, almost playful, but beneath it was something darker, something feral. Jake pressed himself against the back of the stall, his breathing shallow. After what felt like an eternity, the feet turned and walked away. The screaming ceased, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Jake emerged cautiously, his flashlight trembling in his hand. He flipped the ICU lights back on and sprinted back to the security room. The clock read 12:51 a.m. He still had over 5 hours left in his shift, and the rules weren't getting any easier. Jake slumped into the chair in the security room, his chest heaving as he tried to steady his breathing. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with a trembling hand and looked at the clock again, 12:55 a.m. The night felt like an eternity, but time seemed to drag slower with every rule he encountered. The scream, the footsteps, and the voice replayed in his mind like a haunting echo. He couldn't shake the image of those polished shoes standing in a pool of blood. What kind of place was this? Reaching for the rules again, he reread them. His eyes lingered on Rule 5, check on the patients in the general ward at 1 a.m. If one is sitting up, ask if they're okay and fulfill their request, but do not engage in additional conversation. He shuddered. The general ward was supposed to be empty, he'd seen no one during his earlier patrols. If a patient was sitting up now, it meant something else entirely. 1 a.m. Jake stood outside the general ward, the faint ticking of the wall clock echoing in the corridor. He forced himself to step inside, the fluorescent lights above casting harsh shadows across the room. The ward was a long hall with rows of identical beds, each separated by thin, pale blue curtains. Most of the beds were empty, their sheets pulled taut and undisturbed. But as Jake moved deeper into the room, he heard a soft, rasping cough. The sound led him to the last bed on the right. There sat an old woman, her gray hair thin and wispy, her frail frame propped up against the pillows. She wore a hospital gown, and an 4-line dangled from her arm. Jake hesitated, his mouth dry. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked, his voice cracking. The woman's head turned slowly toward him. Her eyes were sunken, her skin pale and papery, but her lips curled into a weak smile. "Water," she croaked. "I need water." Jake exhaled in relief, her request seemed innocent enough. He turned and hurried to the cafeteria, grabbing a paper cup and filling it at the water cooler. As he made his way back, a gnawing doubt crept into his mind. Was this some kind of test? Would giving her water lead to something worse? When he returned, she was staring at the ceiling, her lips moving as if in prayer. Jake handed her the cup, and she took it with shaking hands. She drank slowly, savoring each sip before letting out a contented sigh. "Thank you," she whispered. "You're welcome," Jake said, stepping back. He remembered the rule: no additional conversation. He turned to leave. "Wait," the woman said, her voice stronger now. Jake stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding. "Sit with me," she said. Jake clenched his fists. He wasn't supposed to engage, but she hadn't made a request, only a suggestion. The rules didn't cover this scenario. Slowly, he turned back and sat on the edge of the bed. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the woman leaned closer, her breath sour and warm. "He'll come for you," she whispered. Jake stiffened. "Who?" Her smile widened, revealing teeth that were too sharp. "The surgeon." Jake bolted upright and backed away, his legs shaking. The woman threw her head back and laughed, a guttural, unnatural sound that echoed through the ward. He stumbled out of the room, the laughter following him all the way to the security room. 2 a.m. The security room felt less like a sanctuary and more like a prison. Jake sat in his chair, clutching his phone like a lifeline. He considered calling his boss, quitting on the spot, and walking out of this nightmare. But as his thumb hovered over the dial, he noticed something on the monitors. The cafeteria camera showed movement. A small figure, a child, was sitting at one of the tables, her back to the camera. Jake's stomach dropped. Rule 4. He grabbed the sheet and read it again. If you see a girl with a teddy bear in the cafeteria, sit next to her. Do not speak unless she speaks first. Swallowing hard, he made his way to the cafeteria. The girl was there, just as the camera had shown. She wore a pink dress and held a teddy bear, one of its button eyes dangling by a thread. Her blonde curls framed a face that was eerily still. Jake approached slowly, his footsteps echoing in the empty room. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her, his pulse hammering in his ears. The girl didn't move. She stared at the bear in her lap, her small fingers stroking its worn fur. Minutes passed in heavy silence. Finally, she looked up, her eyes locking onto Jake's. They were dark, bottomless pits that seemed to pull him in. "You forgot the rules," she said, her voice soft but cold. Jake froze. I didn't." "Shoo," she placed a finger to her lips and grinned. "Do you want to play hide and seek?" Jake's breath caught in his throat. "You hide," she said, her grin widening. "I'll count." Before he could respond, she began to count. 1, 2, 3, her voice was sing-song, but there was a sinister edge to it. Jake bolted from the cafeteria, his mind racing. He'd spoken to her, breaking the rule. He sprinted back to the security room, his hands fumbling with the door. Slamming it shut behind him, he grabbed the sheet of rules and reread the last one. Rule 7, if the security cameras fail at any time, hide immediately. Pray they don't find you. As if on cue, the monitors blinked out. The screens went dark, leaving Jake staring at his own pale reflection. 58, 59. The girl's voice echoed faintly through the hallways. Jake's adrenaline surged as he scrambled out of the security room. He needed to hide. Jake ran for the nearest staircase, his boots clattering against the tile. His breathing was ragged, his mind screaming at him to move faster. He climbed to the second floor, his eyes darting for a place to hide. He ducked into an empty patient's room and slammed the door behind him. The room was silent except for the pounding of his heart. He spotted the ceiling tiles and quickly dragged a chair under the access panel. With trembling hands, he pushed the tile aside and hoisted himself into the crawlspace. Below, he heard soft footsteps entering the room. "I know you're here," the girl sang. Her voice was closer now, the sweetness replaced by something sharp and cruel. Jake pressed himself against the beams, trying to stay silent. The ceiling creaked under his weight, and the girl giggled. Come out, wherever you are." The ceiling felt precarious under Jake's weight, each movement threatening to give him away. Beads of sweat dripped from his brow, falling into the darkness below. He held his breath, listening as the girl's footsteps padded closer to where he hid. "I can hear you," she sang, her voice lilting like a nursery rhyme. "You're not very good at this game." Jake clenched his fists, willing the silence to swallow him whole. The room below went quiet. Then, with a sudden jolt, the broom handle jabbed into the ceiling near his hiding spot. Dust and particles rained down on him as the broom poked again and again, each thrust closer than the last. "Don't make me climb up there," she hissed, the sweetness gone from her voice. It was replaced with something guttural, something ancient. Jake shifted his weight slightly, trying to reposition himself on the beam. The ceiling groaned in protest, a loud creak that echoed through the room. The girl giggled, the sound chilling and triumphant. "There you are," she shrieked. The ceiling gave way beneath him, and Jake plummeted, landing hard on the bed below. Pain shot through his shoulder, but he didn't have time to recover. The girl stood in the doorway, her silhouette backlit by the dim hallway light. Her face was a twisted mockery of innocence. Her eyes were dark voids, and her mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin. The teddy bear in her hands dangled limply, its butt knife swinging like a pendulum. Jake scrambled off the bed, his body screaming in protest. He lunged for the door, slamming it shut behind him. His legs propelled him down the hallway, his mind a blur of panic and adrenaline. Jake's only thought was to get back to the first floor. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his breaths ragged and uneven. As he turned the corner, he nearly collided with a man standing near the ICU. The figure was tall and thin, dressed in a surgeon's scrubs that gleamed unnaturally in the dim light. His face was obscured by a surgical mask, but his eyes, cold, calculating, bore into Jake with a terrifying intensity. "Well," the man said, his voice calm and clinical. "What is a patient of mine doing out of his room?" Jake backed away, his instincts screaming at him to run, but his legs felt like lead. The surgeon tilted his head, a scalpel glinting in his gloved hand. "Don't be shy," the man said, taking a deliberate step forward. "You're overdue for your procedure." Jake snapped out of his paralysis and bolted. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to get away. The surgeon's footsteps echoed behind him, slow and steady, as though he were savoring the chase. Jake found himself back on the first floor, his lungs burning with every breath. He darted into the janitor's closet beneath the stairs, the scent of bleach and stale air assaulting his senses. He crouched behind a stack of buckets, his entire body trembling. The footsteps stopped outside the door. "You were smart enough to hide this time," the surgeon said, his voice muffled but unmistakable. "I'm impressed. But you can't hide forever, Jake." Jake bit down on his lip, stifling the sound of his labored breathing. The doorknob rattled, and he clenched his fists, preparing for the worst. But the door didn't open. After a moment, the footsteps receded. Relief washed over him, but it was fleeting. The rules didn't say how to survive this, only to pray they didn't find him. And Jake wasn't sure his prayers would be enough. The clock on Jake's phone read 5:45 a.m. He had 15 minutes left. 15 agonizing minutes until the staff would arrive and the nightmare might end. He remained crouched in the closet, his body aching from the tension. Outside, the hospital was eerily quiet. Too quiet. Then came the sound of a drill, a high-pitched whirring that sent chills down Jake's spine. It was followed by a scream, raw and unbridled, echoing through the halls. Jake covered his ears, rocking back and forth in the darkness. The screaming stopped abruptly, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. Jake's heart pounded as he stared at the closet door, half expecting it to burst open. The minutes crawled by, each one feeling like an eternity. Finally, at 6 a.m., the sound of voices filtered through the halls. Staff members arriving for their morning shift. Jake hesitated before emerging from his hiding spot. He peeked through the door, his eyes scanning the corridor. The harsh fluorescent lights illuminated the space, washing away the shadows that had tormented him all night. A kind-looking older man in a janitor's uniform was mopping the floor near the ICU. When he saw Jake step out of the closet, his eyes widened. "Rough night?" the janitor asked, his tone gentle but knowing. Jake nodded, his throat too dry to speak. The janitor gave him a sympathetic look. "It's over now. You can go home." Jake didn't need to be told twice. He shuffled toward the exit, his legs weak and unsteady. As he stepped outside, the morning sunlight hit his face, warm and soothing. It felt unreal, like stepping into another world. Jake never returned to the hospital. He called his boss later that day and quit without explanation. The man didn't argue, he simply sighed, as if he'd expected it. Jake spent the next few weeks trying to put the experience behind him, but it clung to him like a shadow. Every creak in his apartment, every flicker of a street lamp at night, brought him back to those haunted halls. And sometimes, in his dreams, he heard the little girl counting. 58, 59, 60. "Ready or not, here I come."